I begin this story when there is still no firm ground beneath anyone's feet, when there are no houses, no cities, no names for things, and what exists is an unstable vastness, a silent abyss where nothing is separated from anything else, because before any beauty there was real threat, there was a profound chaos that offered neither shelter nor direction. And I can feel this danger as if I were on the edge of something that could swallow everything at once, for the earth had no form, no outline, no promise, only a thick darkness that stretched over boundless waters. And in this scenario, there was no guarantee that anything good would emerge, since chaos, when not confronted, does not generate life, it only spreads. And it is precisely here that I place you, not in a tranquil garden, but before a world that could very well remain forever disorganized, unstable and hostile, because nothing compels chaos to become order, nothing forces darkness to retreat. And if God did not intervene at that initial moment, everything would remain suspended in constant threat, meaningless, without history, without a future. And this perception, it makes me understand that the Bible doesn't begin with comfort, but with risk, with a scenario where the absence of limits is dangerous, because where nothing is defined, everything can be lost. And it is in this tense, almost suffocating environment that something invisible begins to move. While this emptiness remains before me, I realize that I am not merely observing a distant event, but a profound spiritual pattern, because the ancient text describes the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, not as someone rushing to solve everything, but as someone present amidst the instability. This reveals a divine psychology that does not flee from human chaos, but positions itself above it. I begin to understand that God does not create from the denial of emptiness, but from the decision to confront it, like someone attentively observing dangerous territory before taking the first step. This image moves me because it shows that chaos does not disappear by chance. It is confronted by a conscious, intentional, and patient presence. When I think about this, I realize that often the greatest human fear is not the pain itself, but the feeling that no one is there while everything seems out of control. Here, right at the beginning, the Bible breaks this silent anguish, showing that even before form, before beauty, before organized life, there is presence, and this presence is not passive. It observes, evaluates, prepares like someone who knows exactly what needs to be. Said so that disorder does not have the last word. Then something happens that changes everything, but not violently or chaotically, but through a word, because God speaks, and this speech is not decorative, it is not merely symbolic, it is creative, and when the light appears, it does not come only to illuminate, but to separate, to establish clear boundaries between what was indistinct, and I realize that the light does not immediately eliminate all darkness, but creates contrast, creates reference, creates the possibility of orientation, and this is profoundly human, because God does not begin by creating a perfect world all at once. He begins by creating conditions for life to exist. And by separating light from darkness, he teaches that healing does not happen when everything disappears, but when things begin to be organized, named and put in their proper place, and as the days advance, with the sky separated from the waters, dry land emerging, seas being contained, plants sprouting, and cycles being established, I realize that each act of creation is also an act of containing chaos, as if God were constantly telling the universe that there are limits that cannot be outdated, because without limits there is no security, and without security there is no life that can flourish. When I finally reach the moment when humankind is created, I feel the weight of this divine decision, because unlike everything that came before, here God doesn't just speak. He gets involved in a more intimate way, forming man from dust and breathing into him the breath of life. This reveals something essential about human identity, because I am not a product of chance, nor merely part of the created landscape. I am the result of a deliberate gesture, of a closeness that no other being has received in the same way. This brings responsibility, because being made in the image of God is not just a privilege, it is also a calling to live in order, in alignment with the Creator. And when this man is placed in a prepared garden, with clear boundaries and a single warning, I realize that danger still exists, that chaos has not been completely eliminated, only contained, and that human freedom carries with it the real possibility of rupture, because where there is choice, there is risk, and where there is risk, history is not yet secure. That's why this beginning isn't just beautiful, it's tense, because even in a perfect environment, something can go wrong. And this silent tension hangs over everything that has been created, making me understand that the Bible begins by preparing the reader for an uncomfortable but necessary truth, that order needs to be guarded, cultivated, and respected. Otherwise, chaos returns. And as I observe this newly formed world, I know that it's not the end of the story yet, that something within the human heart will be tested, that a future decision will put everything at risk again. And this awareness keeps me attentive, because the God who creates also observes, and the human being who receives everything will still need to choose how to respond to this gift. And this silent question remains in the air, without an immediate answer, while the story continues to unfold. I continue walking within that garden that seemed too safe to fail, observing how the newly established order demanded something often underestimated: inner vigilance. Because even surrounded by abundance, even breathing air that had not yet known corruption, the human heart already carried the capacity to hear different voices, and this perception completely changes how I understand danger. It doesn't enter by force, it doesn't break down walls, it doesn't destroy trees. It begins with a subtle, almost innocent question, posed at the right moment. And I can feel the tension when the serpent appears not as an obvious threat, but as a calculated presence, observing, evaluating, choosing words. Because chaos, when it returns, rarely arrives shouting. It infiltrates, disguises itself as dialogue. And when God had established a clear limit, he did not do so to restrict life, but to protect it. And it is precisely this limit that begins to be questioned, not aggressively, but by insinuating doubt, as if obedience were loss and trust were naivete. And at this point I realized that the true battlefield was never the garden, but the mind. As the conversation unfolds, I observe something profoundly human happening, because the woman begins to look at the fruit not only as something forbidden, but as something desirable, and this shift in perspective reveals a dangerous internal displacement. When trust in God's word begins to weaken, reality is reinterpreted through desire, and this creates intense psychological tension as the human heart tries to reconcile two conflicting voices, one that establishes limits and another that promises autonomy. I understand that sin, before being an act, is an internal reorganization of values, where the creature begins to position itself as the arbiter of what is good and what is bad. And when the decision is made, it doesn't seem dramatic. There are no thunderclaps, no immediate collapse of the garden, just a simple gesture, a silent eating. This shows me how the deepest ruptures often happen without fanfare, almost without witnesses, but with irreversible consequences. The moment a person participates in this choice, something invisible breaks, and I feel the weight of this break not as an immediate external punishment, but as a brutal internal change, because shame arises where there was once transparency, and fear appears where there was once trust. And for the first time, the human being tries to hide from God, not because God has ceased to be good, but because the human heart now finds itself exposed, unprotected, aware of something it doesn't know how to handle. And this scene is painful because it reveals a profound psychological truth. When we break trust, our first impulse is not to seek reconciliation, but to avoid the encounter. And the sound of God's footsteps in the garden, which previously signified communion, now becomes a threat, and this shows how guilt distorts the perception even of the divine presence. When God calls, asking where they are, I realize it's not about ignorance, but about invitation, because God doesn't enter accusing, He enters calling, giving space for the truth to come to light. And yet humanity chooses to defend itself, shift blame, justify itself, and this movement reveals the birth of a pattern that will run throughout biblical history. The human difficulty in taking responsibility when confronted with one's own failure, and yet, in the midst of the announced consequence, in the midst of the pain that would now be part of the human experience, God acts again in a surprising way, covering their nakedness, protecting them, and announcing that evil would not have the final word because someone in the future would crush the serpent's head. And this promise, still vague, still distant, becomes a seed of hope planted precisely in the soil of the fall. When the couple is removed from the garden, I feel the weight of the loss, not only of a physical place, but of an inner condition that could not be recovered in the same way. And the world outside Eden is harder, more hostile, demanding hard work, confrontation, resistance. And this makes me understand that the expulsion is not only punishment, but also protection, because living eternally in a broken state would be unbearable. And by closing the path to the tree of life, God prevents the rupture from becoming eternal, showing that even when chaos returns, it is still limited, still watched over, still embedded within a larger plan that the human being cannot fully perceive at that moment. Thus, the story moves forward carrying this unresolved tension, because humankind now lives outside the garden, conscious, wounded, responsible, and yet accompanied by a God who does not abandon them. And as I observe this painful beginning of the human journey, I understand that the Bible does not try to hide the fragility of the heart, nor soften the consequences of choices, but it also does not allow hope to die, because even outside Eden, the story continues, and something even greater is being prepared silently over time. I now walk outside the boundaries of Eden, and the first sound I hear is not that of leaves in the wind, nor of divine footsteps at dusk, but the human struggle to survive in soil that no longer responds easily, because the earth, once cooperative, now resists, and each harvest demands sweat, repetition, and frustration. In this scenario, the first generation outside the garden is born, children of a world already marked by rupture. I observe Cain and Abel growing not only as brothers, but as symbols of two possible inner paths, both living under the same sky, breathing the same air, receiving similar instructions, and yet developing very different dispositions of the heart. Because from early on, it becomes clear that the fall did not eliminate human spirituality, but made it unstable, vulnerable, subject to distortions. And this strikes me, because even outside Eden, men still seek God, still offer something, still draw near, which shows that the central problem has never been the absence of religiosity, but the quality of what is given and the motivation that sustains the gesture. When the moment of offering arrives, I feel the silent tension growing, because Cain brings the fruit of the earth and Abel brings the firstborn of his flock. And the text doesn't describe God as arbitrary, but attentive, observing not only the object offered, but the heart behind the act. And when Abel's offering is accepted and Cain's is not, something deep breaks within Cain, even before any external action, because rejection, when not processed, quickly transforms into resentment, and resentment, when nurtured, seeks a target. God, perceiving this internal movement, intervenes directly, warning Cain that sin is at the door, desiring to dominate him, but that there is still a choice, there is still a possibility of mastery. And this divine speech is crucial because it reveals that evil does not take human beings by surprise. It warns, it presents itself, it can be confronted. And even so, the final decision remains in the hands of the one who feels the wound. When Cain takes Abel to the field, I realize how violence enters human history not as a sudden explosion, but as the culmination of an untreated internal process. The first murder happens far from witnesses in an open space that should represent freedom, but becomes a stage for death. At that moment, something irreversible is established in human experience, because the spilled blood cries out from the earth, and violence ceases to be merely potential, becoming a concrete, social, and historical reality. When God confronts Cain, it is not because he is unaware of what happened, but because he continues to seek an answer from the human heart. The famous question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" echoes as a terrible psychological landmark, for there arises the attempt to disconnect responsibility from the relationship, as if it were possible to live isolated from the consequences of one's own actions. This question, though ancient, continues to cross generations, because whenever a human being justifies their indifference, they repeat the same mechanism. Cain's punishment is not merely physical separation, but the intensification of his inner turmoil, making him wandering, restless, and restless. This reveals a profound truth of biblical psychology, for violence does not resolve the original pain. It only amplifies and spreads it. Yet even here, God sets a limit to evil, protecting Cain from being killed. This shows that divine justice is not vengeful, but restraining, preventing the spiral of violence from becoming immediate and total. This makes me realize that from the beginning, God acts as the one who restrains chaos, even when humanity unleashes it, because if there were no limits, human history would have ended right there, with the first fratricide, drowned in blood and resentment. As generations advance, I observe the multiplication of life accompanied by the multiplication of corruption, because technology advances, cities emerge, tools are created, but the human heart distances itself more and more from the presence that sustained it. The Bible doesn't romanticize this progress, it describes it soberly, showing that external development doesn't mean inner maturity. And when the text states that the thoughts of the human heart were continually inclined toward evil, I understand that the problem is no longer isolated, but systemic, structural, affecting all of humanity. This perception prepares the ground for an extreme divine decision, because when chaos returns on a full scale, something needs to be done to preserve the very possibility of a future. It is at this point that Noah emerges, not as a spectacular hero, but as a man who walks with God amidst a corrupt generation. And this simplicity is powerful because it shows that faithfulness does not demand perfection, but constancy. And when God announces the flood, I feel the weight of risk again, now no longer local but global, because the entire creation is threatened, and the ark becomes a symbol of salvation amidst judgment, built slowly, under disbelief, under constant tension, while the sky still seems normal. This scene carries a silent question that transcends time, because while the ark is being built, no one yet sees the rain, and yet obedience continues, and this tension remains open because history has not yet revealed whether life will be preserved or submerged, and the fate of the world, once again, is suspended by human decisions before the word of God. I watch the skies slowly closing, not hastily, but with a gravity that transforms the air into something heavy, almost impossible to ignore, because the flood doesn't begin as a sudden spectacle. It begins as a decision already made, awaiting only the moment to manifest itself. And Noah, along with his family, enters the ark not as someone who has won a contest, but as someone who carries the weight of being preserved while everything around is about to be undone. And this silent, almost ritualistic entry carries a profound tension, for crossing the door of the ark means accepting that the known world will be left behind, that relationships, landscapes, and voices will disappear beneath the waters. And when the door closes, not by human hands but by the action of God, the separation becomes definitive, and all of creation seems to hold its breath. When the waters begin to rise, I see not only rain, but the reversal of the created order, because the fountains of the abyss break open and the sky returns to the earth what had previously been separated, and this image is disturbing. For it shows that judgment does not create something new. It dismantles what has been organized, allowing chaos to return temporarily. And while the ark floats, isolated in a world without contours, I realize that salvation does not always mean the absence of fear, because even protected those inside still hear the sound of destruction, still feel the swaying of the waters, still face the uncertainty of how long it will last. And this experience reveals a profound psychological truth, that being preserved by God does not exempt us from experiencing the emotional impact of the losses around us. The days pile up, and the time inside the ark becomes a silent ordeal, because waiting without control intensely tests the mind, and Noah receives no new instructions, no detailed explanations. He simply remains, sustained by the confidence that the same God who brought judgment would also bring an end to it. And when the waters finally begin to recede, it is not all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as if the restoration needed to be recognized step by step, and the sending out of the birds becomes a gesture laden with expectation, because each return, without a sign of land, keeps the tension alive until the olive branch appears, small, fragile, but enough to announce that life still has room to begin again. When the door of the ark is opened, the world that emerges is not identical to what existed before, because the earth now bears scars, and humanity begins anew with the memory of loss. And this changes everything, for the new covenant that God establishes is not based on naivete, but on the recognition of human frailty, and the rainbow in the sky becomes a sign not only for men, but for God himself, a reminder of restraint, of a limit imposed on total judgment. And this image makes me understand that biblical history does not move towards immediate perfection, but towards a coexistence between mercy and responsibility, where life continues, even knowing the human potential for rupture. As Noah's descendants spread out, I realize that human unity quickly transforms into collective pride, because instead of filling the earth as commanded, they concentrate, build, plan a name for themselves, and the tower that rises is not just a physical building, but a powerful psychological symbol, representing the human desire to control one's own destiny without depending on God. And when languages are confused, it is not just punishment, but forced dispersion, a divine intervention to prevent concentrated arrogance from again producing a global rupture. And this reveals that sometimes division is a form of protection, not abandonment. In this fragmented scenario emerges a man named Abram, living amidst idols in a land that does not know the true God. When God calls him to leave, he offers no details, only an open promise, demanding trust before any concrete evidence. This call marks a profound change in how God acts, because now he does not deal with humanity as a whole, but chooses to work through a specific family, planting there the seed of a greater plan. As Abram journeys to an unknown land, carrying promises still unseen, the story enters a new phase where hope ceases to be collective and diffuse, becoming personal, fragile, dependent on faith. This transition keeps the tension alive because everything now seems to rest on the faithfulness of an ordinary man before a God who demands trust without a map. I follow Abram as he traverses lands that do not belong to him, setting up and taking down tents, digging wells that he doesn't know if he will be able to use for long, living as a stranger in places that God has called his future inheritance. And this condition of constant pilgrimage creates a silent tension because walking sustained only by promise requires a kind of trust that is not nourished by immediate results. And the more time passes, the more evident the contrast becomes between the received word and the visible reality. For Abram grows old, Sarai grows old, and the womb that should carry the promise remains closed. And this prolonged silence is not neutral. It wears down, tests not only faith in God, but the interpretation one makes of the promise itself. Because when the wait extends too long, the human mind begins to seek shortcuts that seem reasonable. When the solution presented emerges through Hagar, I realize that it is not about open rebellion, but about an attempt to help God fulfill what he himself had promised. And this dynamic is profoundly human, because anxiety in the face of delay often disguises itself as spiritual pragmatism. And the birth of Ishmael brings momentary relief, but does not resolve the central tension, because the promise was not only about descendants, but about a specific son, the fruit of a divine action. Impossible to confuse with human effort, and when God reaffirms his covenant, changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's to Sarah, he is not only adjusting identity, but repositioning history, making it clear that fulfillment will not come from force, strategy, or cultural adaptation, but from direct intervention in the impossible. When Isaac is finally born, I feel the accumulated weight of decades dissolving into a single event, because the laughter that had previously been one of disbelief transforms into reverent joy. And this birth doesn't erase the past, but gives it new meaning, showing that the fulfilled promise doesn't eliminate the scars of waiting, it only integrates them into history. And that's precisely why the next test becomes so unsettling. Because asking for Isaac isn't just asking for a child. It's touching the most sensitive point of human trust, questioning whether faith was in the promise or in the gift that the promise brought. As I climb the mountain with Isaac, I realize that Abraham doesn't walk like a fanatic, but like someone carrying a painful obedience, sustained by a trust that doesn't fully comprehend the request. This scene reveals a profound spiritual psychology because obeying without understanding requires a type of faith that isn't based on control. And when God intervenes at the last moment, providing the lamb, he not only spares Isaac, but redefines the pattern of relationship, showing that he doesn't desire human sacrifices, but hearts that trust to the limit. This experience marks Abraham definitively, establishing a principle that will echo throughout Scripture, that God himself will provide what is necessary for the promise to move forward. As Isaac grows up, the story doesn't stabilize, because the promise continues to be carried by people aware of their fragility, and when Esau and Jacob are born, the tension returns, now within the womb itself, announcing that the struggle will not only be external, but internal to the people being formed, and the reversal of expectations, with the younger being chosen, reveals that the divine plan does not submit to human hierarchies, and this choice generates deep family conflicts, marked by deception, favoritism, and resentment, showing that the promise does not instantly transform character, but walks through broken relationships. When Jacob flees, carrying both blessing and guilt, I accompany him in his nocturnal solitude, lying on a stone, dreaming of a ladder connecting heaven and earth. And this vision becomes a landmark, because God presents himself not only as the one who blesses the righteous, but as the one who accompanies the fugitive, reaffirming promises even when conscience is heavy, and by changing Jacob's name to Israel after an intense struggle, God seals the identity of a people born not from perfection, but from the honest confrontation with their own fragility. And this struggle leaves marks, because whoever encounters God in this way never emerges unscathed, but also never without purpose. I watch the house of Israel grow in number, but also in tension, because the 12 sons carry not only the inherited promise, but unresolved emotional wounds, evident favoritism, and constant comparisons. At the center of this imbalance is Joseph, marked from an early age by dreams he doesn't know how to manage, and by a paternal love that separates him from his brothers. This involuntary prominence quickly becomes a target, because envy doesn't spring from nothing. It feeds on the feeling of injustice. When Joseph speaks of his dreams, he doesn't just provoke irritation, he threatens internal structures, awakening the fear of losing position, identity, and value. And I perceive how the violence that began with Cain reappears now in a collective form, more organized, colder. When Joseph is sent to the field to find his brothers, the scene carries a silent weight, because he walks confidently, unaware that he has already been judged from afar, and when he is seen from a distance, even before he arrives, the decision to eliminate him begins to form, showing that evil often consolidates itself before direct confrontation. When thrown into the empty pit, Joseph experiences a fall not only physical but existential, because in a few moments he goes from beloved son to disposable. And the silence of that dry hole symbolizes something profound, the feeling of abandonment that finds no immediate explanation. And when he is sold as merchandise, the rupture becomes definitive, because the family bond is exchanged for silver, and the promise now seems completely detached from the expected path. In Egypt, far from any known reference point, Joseph needs to rebuild his identity without the protection of his father's name or the memory of the promise. And when he prospers in Potiphar's house, I realize that faithfulness does not guarantee the absence of injustice, because the false accusation throws him down again, now in prison. This repetition of the fall tests something essential, because maintaining integrity when no one is watching requires a faith that does not depend on visible reward. Even there, in the oblivion of the cells, God remains present, not immediately freeing him, but sustaining Joseph from within, developing in him an ability to interpret dreams that does not arise as an isolated gift, but as the fruit of attentive listening amidst pain. When Joseph is finally summoned to Pharaoh's presence after years of waiting, the change is abrupt, almost disconcerting, because the same man who woke up a prisoner now sleeps as governor. This sudden rise is not the result of revenge or retaliation, but of a providential repositioning. When famine strikes the region and his brothers arrive seeking food, the story reaches a point of intense psychological tension. For now Joseph has absolute power over those who wronged him. The past returns not as a distant memory, but as an opportunity for choice. When he tests his brothers, he does not do so out of cruelty, but to discern whether there has been transformation. And when it finally reveals itself, the forgiveness he offers does not ignore the wrong suffered, but places it within a greater purpose, recognizing that God transformed destructive intent into the preservation of life. By bringing his entire family to Egypt, Joseph ensures their survival, but he also establishes an important historical shift, because the people of the promise now live as strangers in a foreign land, protected for a time, but vulnerable to being forgotten by future generations. When Israel dies, blessing his children, history enters a period of progressive silence, where the promise remains, but oppression slowly approaches, setting the stage for a new kind of collective suffering. This transition makes me realize that God does not rush processes, because those who will be liberated will first need to feel the weight of slavery to understand the value of redemption. Thus, the story does not end in a comfortable victory, but in tense expectation, because the people grow, but also become a threat in the eyes of Egyptian power, and as generations pass, something begins to form in the invisible, for the promise made to Abraham remains alive, even when the people do not realize it, and this awareness keeps the narrative open, sustained by the certainty that God has not yet finished what he began, even when everything seems to indicate otherwise. I move forward in the story when time has already become burdensome for the people who carry the promise, because what began as welcome in Egypt slowly transforms into suspicion, then fear, and finally outright oppression. This transition doesn't happen overnight, but through a progressive forgetting, as a new Pharaoh emerges who didn't know Joseph, didn't inherit gratitude, nor carry memory. And when history loses memory, it becomes cruel, and the numerical growth of Israel's descendants, which should be a sign of blessing, begins to be interpreted as a political threat, generating harsh, strategic, and dehumanizing decisions. Thus, the people of the promise are reduced to a workforce, to statistics, to the fear of the dominant power. And I realize that slavery always begins in the gaze of the other, when they cease to see people and begin to see only risk and utility. While the days repeat themselves under the weight of bricks, whips, and endless journeys, something happens internally to the people, because identity is slowly being eroded, and when generations are born without knowing freedom, oppression ceases to be merely external and begins to mold the soul, creating a psychology of survival, of silence, of forced resignation. And this makes the outcry weaker at first, almost non-existent, until the pain accumulates to such an extent that it transforms into a collective cry, and this cry rises not as a well-formulated prayer, but as raw despair. And Scripture makes it clear that God does not ignore this kind of cry, because he does not respond only to correct language, but to real pain. And when he decides to act, he does not do so generically, but by calling a specific man, shaped by broken trajectories. I follow Moses' emergence amidst a death decree, because Pharaoh decides to eliminate the Hebrew boys to curb the growth of the people, and this context already establishes extreme risk, since life is threatened from the womb. When Moses' mother hides him, then entrusts him to the waters, she does so not out of abandonment, but out of desperate faith. The river, which should be an instrument of death, unexpectedly becomes a path of preservation, because Moses is raised within the very palace of the oppressor. Learning the language, customs, and power of the system he will one day confront. This historical irony reveals something profound about the divine method, for God often forms his liberators within the structures they will need to confront. When Moses grows up and sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, his reaction is impulsive and violent, and this mistake is not minimized by the narrative, because liberation is not born ready-made. It needs to be honed. The murder forces him to flee, leaving behind both privilege and a clear identity. In the desert, Moses spends decades in anonymity, tending sheep that are not his own, learning rhythm, silence, and dependence. This time is not wasted, but profound psychological preparation, because those who lead wounded people must first learn to control impulses and listen before acting. It is in this context that the calling happens, not in a palace, but before a bush that burns without being consumed, breaking common logic and forcing attention. When God speaks, he does not ignore Moses' resistance, because fear, feelings of inadequacy, and memories of failure are still fresh in his mind. This honesty in the narrative strengthens identification, as Moses does not respond as a confident hero, but as someone aware of his limitations. Yet God persists, revealing his name, his intention, and his commitment to the suffering of the people. This revelation marks a turning point in history because liberation ceases to be merely a distant hope and takes on a concrete direction, although still fraught with risks, since confronting Pharaoh means confronting the absolute power of the known world. When Moses returns to Egypt and demands freedom, he does not encounter immediate repentance, but rather aggravated resistance. And this deepens the suffering of the people, who begin to question whether divine intervention was truly worthwhile. This moment is psychologically crucial because when newly born hope generates more pain, the human tendency is to reject it. Yet God does not back down, but intensifies his action through signs and plagues that are not mere punishments, but direct confrontations against the idea that Pharaoh is sovereign. Each plague dismantles a false sense of security, revealing the limits of human power before the Creator. When the final plague is announced, the atmosphere becomes unbearable because death takes center stage in the narrative, and Easter night carries an almost palpable tension, as salvation now depends on precise obedience, on blood on the doorposts, on readiness to depart. And this scene inextricably links judgment and protection, showing that redemption is not the absence of cost, but the passage through it. And when the people finally leave, they do not do so as an organized and confident group, but as a traumatized crowd carrying haste, fear, and disbelief, and yet still being led. When the sea parts, the threat reaches its peak, because the people are trapped between the water and the army, and collective despair explodes in accusations, revealing that external liberation does not immediately cure internal slavery. When God intervenes, opening a path where there was none, he not only saves but redefines the people's imagination, showing that apparent limits do not restrict his actions. Even after the victory song, the journey through the desert quickly reveals that the memory of the miracle alone does not sustain daily confidence, as scarcity awakens complaints, a distorted longing for captivity, and resistance to dependence. Thus, liberation is shown as a long process, not an isolated event, because God is not only taking Israel out of Egypt, but trying to take Egypt out of Israel. And this task proves to be complex, slow, and painful, keeping history fraught with tension because the promise advances, but the human heart still struggles to keep pace with redemption. I watch the people advancing through the desert not as a confident crowd, but as a disoriented group, carrying in their bodies the newly won freedom and in their minds old habits of forced dependence. And this contradiction creates constant friction, because the absence of chains does not immediately mean the presence of faith. And when food begins to run out, fear reappears forcefully, not as something new, but as a return of something familiar. For hunger has the capacity to erase recent memories of liberation and resurrect distorted memories of captivity. And I realize that the desert is not just a geographical place, but a psychological environment where trust is tested daily, because there are no stocks there, no visible guarantees, only the promise of provision that needs to be renewed every morning. When the manna begins to fall, it doesn't come in a cumulative abundance, but in daily measure, sufficient only for that day. This logic directly confronts the human desire for control, as the people are forced to learn continuous dependence without reserves for tomorrow. This generates tension because trusting God every day is more difficult than trusting Him just once. When some try to hoard more than commanded, the food spoils, revealing that divine provision cannot be managed by the same criteria of fear. This dynamic reveals a profound spiritual pedagogy, for God is not only sustaining bodies, but also re-educating minds that have been shaped by scarcity and oppression. As they journey, internal conflicts arise, leadership disputes emerge, complaints against Moses occur, And this behavior is not presented as a surprise, but as a natural consequence of a people who do not yet know how to handle freedom. When water runs out and thirst becomes unbearable, rebellion erupts again, revealing that faith is still fragile, reactive, and conditioned by circumstances. Even so, God intervenes, making water spring from the rock, showing that his patience is not proportional to human maturity, but to his commitment to the promise. Each miracle in the desert not only resolves a momentary crisis, but exposes the contrast between divine faithfulness and human instability. When the people arrive at Mount Sinai, the narrative takes on a solemn weight, because their God not only provides, but reveals himself intensely, surrounded by thunder, smoke, and trembling, creating an atmosphere that does not allow for indifference. This powerful manifestation makes it clear that the freedom granted now demands a covenant, for a liberated people without direction easily loses its way. In giving the law, God is not imposing tyranny, but offering structure, showing how a free community can live without destroying itself internally. The commandments emerge as protective boundaries, not as arbitrary punishments, establishing an order that reflects the character of God himself. While Moses remains on the mountain, time once again becomes a testing ground, because waiting without detailed explanations rekindles old insecurities, and the people, feeling abandoned, seek something visible to replace the invisible presence of God. The golden calf appears not as an explicit rejection of the God who freed them, but as an attempt to make him controllable, manipulable, adapted to human expectations. This decision reveals a dangerous spiritual psychology, because when the sacred becomes an object, it loses its capacity to confront, and idolatry is born less from the desire to deny God and more from the desire to mold him. When Moses goes down and finds the people celebrating before the idol, the rupture is profound, because the newly established covenant is broken even before it is fully understood, and Moses' reaction expresses not only anger but pain, for he sees there the repetition of old patterns, the inability to sustain trust when the divine presence is not immediately perceptible, and the episode leaves severe marks, showing that spiritual choices have collective consequences, and that freedom without fidelity quickly turns into disorder. Even after this serious failure, God does not abandon the project, but redefines the path, reaffirming his presence, but also establishing clear limits. And when Moses intercedes for the people, asking God to continue with them, this prayer becomes one of the most revealing moments of the narrative, because it shows that the divine presence is what distinguishes that people from all others, and without it, the promised land would lose its meaning, and this awareness shapes the identity of Israel, not as a powerful nation, but as a people dependent on the continuous presence of God. As the journey progresses, the years accumulate, and the generation that left Egypt begins to die in the desert, not for lack of provision, but for lack of trust. This harsh reality reveals that promises are not automatically inherited, they must be embraced by each generation. When the spies return, with frightening reports about the promised land, collective fear once again overshadows the memory of miracles, and the refusal to move forward seals the fate of that generation, condemned to wander until a new one arises, capable of trusting. During this prolonged period, marked by rebellions, punishments, and partial restorations, I realize that God is forming not only a people who know his works, but a people who need to learn to know him amidst frustration. This slow formation, full of falls and restarts, keeps history in constant tension because the promise remains before them, visible on the horizon, but still unattainable, sustaining the expectation that something decisive still needs to happen for the people to finally enter the promised rest. I watch time advance until a new generation rises, shaped not by memories of Egypt, but by experiences in the desert. And this difference is fundamental, because those who grew up walking among tents, pillars of fire, and clouds learned to see God not only as a distant liberator, but as a constant presence. And yet, the transition does not happen without pain. For Moses, the leader who guided the people for decades, reaches the limit of his own journey, carrying both a deep intimacy with God and the weight of failures that cannot be ignored. And when he contemplates the promised land from afar, unable to enter, the narrative reveals a truth difficult to accept, that even great leaders experience real consequences, and that God's plan is greater than any individual, however faithful they may have been. When Joshua assumes leadership, the atmosphere changes, not because he is superior, but because this stage of the journey demands a different kind of courage. It is no longer about surviving in the desert, but about advancing against concrete obstacles, fortified cities, established peoples, and ancient fears that still echo in the collective memory. The first major barrier is the Jordan River, overflowing at harvest time, creating a scene charged with tension. Crossing that river means definitively breaking with the nomadic past and entering a land that needs to be conquered. And when the waters part before the ark, repeating the miracle of the sea, God reaffirms that his presence continues to guide the people, not as a distant memory, but as a living reality. Upon entering the land, the first confrontation is not with swords, but with an unusual strategy, because Jericho does not fall through human strength, but through persistent obedience to an instruction that defies military logic. This choice reveals that God is still teaching the people to depend more on his word than on their own ability. When the walls fall, not only do stones crumble, but also the idea that success will come in the same way that other nations conquer territory. This initial victory establishes a dangerous pattern, as confidence can easily turn into self-sufficiency. The episode of Achan quickly exposes this fragility, because a hidden act of disobedience compromises the entire community, showing that conquering the land is not just an external battle, but an internal discipline. When the people suffer an unexpected defeat at the hands of a lesser enemy, the frustration reveals that God's presence cannot be presumed. It needs to be continually honored. This moment marks the understanding that the promise does not eliminate the need for spiritual vigilance, as even small concessions can lead to great losses. As the campaigns progress, alliances are formed, strategic errors occur, and the land is occupied gradually, not immediately. This slowness is not a flaw in the plan, but part of it, because God does not give everything at once, so that the people learn to manage what they receive. This divine pedagogy reveals that an inheritance without maturity turns into ruin, and even after the conquest, the distribution of the land requires care, justice, and memory, because forgetting the origin of the blessing generates internal conflicts as destructive as external enemies. When Joshua grows old, he gathers the people and reminisces about their entire journey, not out of nostalgia, but as a warning, because remaining in the promised land depends on continued faithfulness. His final exhortation carries profound psychological weight because he presents the people with a clear choice: to serve the God who led them or to mingle with the gods of the surrounding nations. This choice reveals that the promise never negates human freedom, but only guides it. By declaring that he and his household will serve the Lord, Joshua speaks not only as a leader, but as someone who understood the cost and value of the covenant. As the narrative nears the end of this cycle, I realize that the biblical story doesn't move in a straight line toward perfection, but in a spiral, revisiting themes of faithfulness, fall, restoration, and choice. The promised land, though reached, is still fragile because the greatest challenge is not conquering territory, but sustaining an identity aligned with God amidst abundance. This tension remains open, preparing the ground for a new period in history, where the absence of central leadership will reveal what has truly been formed in the hearts of the people. Thus the promise finds partial fulfillment, real, tangible, but not definitive, keeping alive the expectation of something deeper, more lasting, which still needs to manifest itself, because God's history with his people does not end with the possession of a land, but continues to advance towards a restoration that transcends borders, kings, and generations. And this awareness keeps the narrative in motion, sustained by the silent question of what will happen when the people need to choose. Again, who truly governs their hearts? I move forward in time and realize that after Joshua's death, something subtle, yet dangerous, begins to take root in the hearts of the people, because the central leadership that kept the memory alive is gone, and in its place a void emerges that is not immediately filled. This void does not generate instant chaos, but progressive neglect. As each tribe begins to look after itself, each family builds its own interpretation of the covenant, and slowly the memory of God's deeds begins to lose clarity, not because they have been deliberately forgotten, but because they cease to be taught with the same intensity. This transition reveals a fundamental psychological truth, that faith that is not continually narrated, practiced, and remembered weakens, even when its foundations are solid. During this period, I observed the emergence of a repetitive pattern that spans generations, because the people distance themselves, face oppression, cry out, are freed, experience temporary peace, and then distance themselves again. This cycle is not presented as mere stubbornness, but as a reflection of a human heart that has not yet learned to sustain faithfulness without external pressure. While the threat is real, dependence on God grows, but when peace settles in, vigilance diminishes, and the gods of neighboring nations begin to seem less dangerous and more attractive. This emotional oscillation creates an unstable environment where spiritual identity is never fully consolidated. When judges emerge, I realize they are not ideal leaders in the classical sense, but rather specific instruments of divine intervention, raised up in moments of extreme crisis. Each one carries evident flaws, unstable temperaments, and complex personal histories, revealing that God does not expect perfection to act, but rather willingness. And yet, each liberation achieved is limited in time, because the transformation does not deeply reach the collective heart. When the external threat disappears, the people return to the same patterns, like someone who learns to breathe only while submerged, but forgets the lesson upon returning to the surface. When observing figures like Gideon, Samson, and Deborah, I realize that strength lies not only in the power granted by God, but in the constant tension between obedience and self-sufficiency. Because even after clear experiences of divine intervention, human beings remain vulnerable to the temptation to attribute success to themselves, and this vulnerability keeps history in a state of continuous alert, since every victory carries within it the risk of a future fall, and this risk is never completely eliminated. As the people begin to desire a king, I feel the weight of this transition, because the request arises not only from the need for organization, but from comparison with other nations, revealing a deep desire for normality, predictability, and control. And when God allows this change, he does not do so without warnings, for the monarchy will bring apparent stability, but also new dangers, since concentrated power can both protect and corrupt. This decision marks an important historical turning point, as the direct relationship between God and the people becomes mediated by a human figure with expanded authority. When Saul is chosen, his imposing appearance and promising start create hope. but quickly reveal deep insecurity as partial obedience, fear of others' opinions, and difficulty waiting for God's timing compromise his leadership. This trajectory shows that authority without submission generates instability, and when Saul loses divine favor, it is not due to a lack of potential, but to an inability to align personal will with the word received. This rupture opens the way for a new choice. It is then that David emerges, an unlikely young shepherd, ignored even by his own family, and this divine choice once again exposes God's pattern, which is not guided by appearances but by the heart. And the victory over Goliath is not just a military triumph, but an affirmation that trust in God still has a place among a people accustomed to measuring strength only by visible criteria. And yet, David's rise is neither immediate nor linear, for he spends years fleeing, being unjustly persecuted, learning to lead in the desert, and this slow formation molds a type of king who knows both the promise and the pain of waiting. When David finally assumes the throne, the kingdom is strengthened, Jerusalem is established as a spiritual and political center, and the ark returns, bringing with it a renewed sense of divine presence. This moment seems to mark a climax, as the promise made to Abraham now materializes in an established nation with territory, leadership, and identity. God also makes a covenant with David, promising that his throne would continue, pointing to a future even greater than the present moment. However, even at this peak, human frailty does not disappear, because David's sin reveals that intimacy with God does not eliminate the need for constant vigilance, and the consequences of this mistake permeate his family, his kingdom, and the people themselves, showing that the divine promise does not prevent the pain generated by misguided choices, but redirects it within a greater plan, and this reality keeps the narrative in tension, as hope now coexists with open wounds. As the story progresses toward succession, internal divisions begin to emerge, setting the stage for future conflicts. And I realize that even with kings, laws, and structures, the human heart remains the decisive field of loyalty. This realization keeps the story open, because something still seems to be missing, something that imperfect kings and repetitive cycles cannot fully resolve, sustaining the expectation of a deeper, more lasting solution that has not yet fully manifested itself. I move forward in time and realize that after David's reign, the heart of the kingdom begins to reveal fissures that did not appear suddenly, but were slowly forming, because Solomon, the son of the promise, assumes the throne with recognized wisdom, international prestige, and a peace that no previous generation had experienced. This initial scenario creates the feeling that everything is finally in its place, that the project has reached its peak, and when the temple is built with richness, detail, and solemnity, it seems that the presence of God has found a permanent dwelling among the people, consolidating a solid spiritual and national identity, and for a moment, history breathes a sigh of relief, as if the promise had found its definitive rest. However, I realize that abundance brings with it a silent risk, because what once required daily dependence can now be sustained by structures, political alliances, and accumulated resources. And Solomon, despite the wisdom he received, begins to gradually distance himself from the simplicity of the covenant, multiplying foreign wives, embracing customs, and allowing other gods to find space in his heart. This concession does not happen as an explicit rupture, but as a gradual adaptation, revealing that spiritual estrangement rarely begins with open denial, but with progressive tolerance, and when the heart is divided, fidelity loses clarity. After Solomon's death, the kingdom fragmented, not only territorially, but also emotionally, as accumulated tensions exploded into division, separating Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This rupture was not only political but also spiritual, as each side began to construct its own narrative of legitimacy, its own centers of worship, its own justifications. I realized that when unity is lost, truth becomes more vulnerable to manipulation, and the people, now divided, began to walk in different directions, although carrying the same heritage. In the Northern Kingdom, kings succeed one another rapidly, marked by instability, idolatry, and violence, and worship becomes an instrument of political control, distancing the people from the original covenant. Meanwhile, in the South, despite moments of faithfulness, the pattern does not hold, as even pious kings coexist with corrupt practices and dangerous concessions. This constant alternation between reform and decadence creates a collective spiritual weariness, as the people no longer know what to expect or in whom to fully trust. It is in this scenario that prophets emerge, not as comfortable figures, but as unsettling voices raised to confront kings, denounce injustices, and remind the people of the essence of the covenant. I realize that the prophetic role is not to predict the distant future, but to interpret the present in the light of God's faithfulness, exposing what has been distorted. And when prophets like Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and Jeremiah speak, their words are not abstract, but directed, full of urgency, because the danger lies not only in visible idolatry, but in social injustice, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and false religious security. Observing confrontations like Elijah's on Mount Carmel, I realize that the central problem was not the absence of signs, but the indecision of the heart, as the people wavered between the Lord and other gods, trying to reconcile incompatible loyalties. This conflict reveals a profound spiritual psychology because the human heart resists definitive choices, preferring gray areas that offer a sense of control. Prophets emerge precisely to shatter this illusion, calling the people back to a clear, even if painful, decision. Despite the warnings, the estrangement continues, and the consequences inevitably approach. Because political alliances replace trust in God, foreign armies become a constant threat. And when the Northern Kingdom finally falls to Assyria, the event is not presented as a surprise, but as the culmination of a long process of infidelity, and this fall serves as a visible warning, a mirror that should provoke repentance in the Southern Kingdom, but which does not always fulfill this role. In Judah, the presence of the temple creates a false sense of security, as if the sacred space guaranteed automatic protection, and the prophets need to confront this belief, reminding people that God's presence cannot be reduced to buildings or rituals. When Babylon emerges as a new power, the threat intensifies, and even belated reforms fail to completely reverse the course of events, because superficial repentance does not sustain lasting transformation. When Jerusalem finally falls and the people are taken into exile, I feel the weight of this profound historical rupture, because it is not just a matter of territorial loss, but of identity crisis, since the people of the promise now live far from the land, the temple, and the structures that sustained their faith, and this forced experience of displacement exposes the human heart to fundamental questions, questioning whether God is still present, whether the covenant has been definitively broken, and whether history has come to an end. However, even in exile, the narrative does not end in absolute silence, because prophets continue to speak, announcing that discipline is not abandonment, that judgment does not eliminate the promise, and that a return will still be possible. These words, spoken in a foreign land, keep alive a hope that no longer depends on visible structures, but on God's faithfulness to His own word. This transition is crucial as it prepares the people to understand that the covenant is not limited to a place, but rooted in a relationship. Thus, the story enters a period of profound pain, but also of refinement, because everything that seemed essential is removed, leaving only the central question, Who is God when everything else is lost? And this question continues to echo, sustaining the narrative tension because something still needs to happen for the promise to find a fulfillment that cannot be broken again by human divisions. And this expectation keeps the story alive, open, awaiting a new decisive move on God's part. I move forward in time and feel the weight of a silence unlike any before, because after the exile and the gradual return to the land, something essential still seems missing. The people return, rebuild walls, raise the temple again, reorganize community life, but the glory that once filled the place does not manifest itself in the same way, and this absence creates an uncomfortable, almost melancholic feeling, as if something were incomplete. I realize that the external restoration did not automatically produce a full inner restoration, because although explicit idolatry has been abandoned, the human heart continues to struggle with pride, religious formalism, and distorted expectations about God's actions. During this period, faith comes to rely heavily on law, tradition, and memory, and this is necessary but also dangerous. Because when obedience becomes a security mechanism, it risks losing its relational function, and spirituality begins to organize itself around rules, interpretations, and rigid boundaries, creating an identity based more on separation than on transformation. I realize that people learn to survive spiritually without expecting major interventions, like someone who gets used to living with longing for what was once intense, but now seems distant. Prophets cease to appear with the same frequency, and the direct voice of God seems to become rarer, creating a long interval that spans generations. This silence is not empty, but a test, for it forces the people to decide whether they will remain faithful without extraordinary stimuli. At the same time, the ancient promises continue to be read, repeated, and taught, fueling a diffuse expectation of a Messiah who would come to restore the throne, liberate the people, and inaugurate a definitive time of justice. This hope is mixed with frustration because foreign domination persists, first under successive empires and then under Rome, reinforcing the feeling that history has not yet reached the promised point. As I observe this scenario, I realize that the messianic expectation is beginning to fragment as different groups imagine its fulfillment in distinct ways. Some expect a strong political leader, others a rigorous religious reformer, still others an apocalyptic sign of immediate judgment. This diversity reveals something profound about the human heart, for each person projects onto the promise what they most desire or fear most, and this movement creates an environment charged with spiritual tension where everyone expects something, but few are prepared to recognize when that something actually arrives. It is in this context that, far from the centers of power, a voice emerges in the desert, simple, austere, calling the people to repentance. And John appears not as an accommodator of expectations, but as a confronter, denouncing hypocrisy, calling for inner transformation, and announcing that something greater is about to manifest itself. And this message resonates powerfully precisely because it breaks the accumulated silence, rekindling the feeling that God still speaks, still acts, still observes the heart. And I realize that repentance here is not a ritual, but a psychological and spiritual preparation for something that will require a profound change in perception. When Jesus finally appears in the narrative, he does not enter as a crowned king or as a military leader, but as an ordinary man, coming from Galilee, walking among simple people. And this initial choice already destabilizes expectations, because the fulfillment begins discreetly, almost invisible to the eyes of the established power. And when he approaches John to be baptized, the gesture carries a profound meaning, for he identifies with a wounded people, assuming a position of humility that radically contrasts with the image of a triumphant liberator. And at that moment, when the heavens open and the voice declares approval, the story reaches a point of silent convergence, for there the ancient promise begins to take concrete form. Following Jesus' first steps, I realize that his presence provokes intense and contradictory reactions, for he heals, teaches, forgives, and confronts, revealing a type of authority that is not based on force or institutional tradition, but on intimacy with God. This authority shakes internal structures because it offers grace without bargaining and demands transformation without violence, and this creates both attraction and resistance, because accepting this type of kingdom means giving up control, status, and certainties built up over centuries. When Jesus begins to speak of the kingdom of God, he does not describe it as territory to be conquered, but as a reality that pervades daily life, comparing it to seeds, leaven, and hidden treasures. These simple images carry enormous psychological depth, showing that God's actions do not follow the patterns of human grandeur, and that true transformation begins small, almost imperceptibly, requiring attention and discernment. This approach frustrates those who expect immediate and external change, but deeply touches those who recognize their own inner fragility. As conflicts with religious leaders intensify, it becomes clear that the problem is not the law itself, but the way it has been used to protect rigid identities and exclude those deemed unworthy. Jesus confronts this system not with contempt, but with revelation, exposing hidden motivations and calling people back to the heart of the covenant, which has always been love for God and neighbor. This message threatens the established balance, as it wrests control from the hands of those who benefit from spiritual rigidity. Meanwhile, the disciples follow Jesus without fully understanding the scope of what is happening, carrying expectations mixed with fear, enthusiasm, and incomprehension. This journey reveals that following the fulfillment of the promise does not eliminate confusion, but demands progressive trust, because the path chosen by God continues to be surprising, uncomfortable, and profoundly human. I realize that the story is approaching a critical point, because the more Jesus reveals the heart of the kingdom, the clearer it becomes that this kingdom will not be received without violent resistance. Thus, the narrative enters its most tense phase, as the ancient promise is finally set in motion, but the clash between human expectation and divine purpose intensifies with each step, and everything indicates that the path to definitive restoration will not involve immediate coronation, but confrontation, rejection, and sacrifice, keeping the question hanging in the air about exactly how God intends to fulfill what he promised from the beginning. And this silent expectation sustains the story, because something decisive still needs to happen for the chaos, guilt, and separation to be finally confronted. I follow Jesus' steps as the tension around him becomes increasingly visible, because the more he reveals the kingdom, the more he threatens structures that are sustained by fear, control, and the appearance of holiness. And this threat is not abstract. It materializes in suspicious glances, in barbed questions, in attempts to discredit his authority before the people. I realize that the danger grows, not because Jesus has lost control of the situation, but because he refuses to soften the truth to preserve acceptance. And this choice puts him on a direct collision course with religious leaders and political authorities who cannot allow this kind of kingdom to advance without resistance. While he teaches in parables and confronts hypocrisies with almost surgical precision, I observe that his disciples begin to feel the weight of what it means to be associated with him, because following Jesus ceases to be merely spiritual learning and becomes a concrete risk. And this psychological change is profound because it requires each person to confront their own expectations of security, success, and recognition. And when Jesus begins to speak openly about suffering, rejection, and death, the discomfort increases because this discourse does not fit into any of the popular messianic images, revealing that the path chosen by God continues to contradict the deepest desires for human control. Upon entering Jerusalem, the city that concentrates hope, power, and religious memory, the initial reception seems to confirm old expectations as crowds celebrate, shout, scatter branches, and for a brief moment, everything seems to indicate triumph. But I realize that this acclamation carries a dangerous fragility because it is fueled by projections, not by real understanding. Jesus enters not mounted on a symbol of war, but in humility, making it clear that the kind of king he is does not correspond to the kind of king the people expect, and this dissonance prepares the ground for a rapid shift in collective mood. In the following days, the confrontations intensify, and the atmosphere becomes charged with silent tension because decisions are being made away from the crowds, in closed rooms, in strategic conversations, and when Judas decides to betray, he does not do so as a caricatured villain, but as someone confused, disappointed, perhaps trying to force a different outcome. And this betrayal reveals that physical proximity to Jesus does not guarantee understanding of his purpose, because the human heart can walk alongside the truth and still stray from it internally. On the night of the Last Supper, the atmosphere is dense, almost suffocating, because Jesus speaks of farewell while the disciples are still debating positions and grandeur. And this contradiction once again exposes the distance between the announced kingdom and human understanding. When he breaks the bread and shares the wine, he redefines ancient symbols, pointing to an imminent sacrifice that is not yet fully understood. And by washing the disciples' feet, he radically subverts hierarchies, showing that power in the kingdom is manifested through service, not domination. This lesson, though simple in form, carries a profound psychological demand as it directly confronts human pride. When Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, I feel the emotional weight intensify because there are no crowds, no public speeches, only prayer, silence, and anguish. This scene reveals something rarely explored, the vulnerability of the Son of God in the face of imminent pain. He does not face the cross with indifference, but with real inner struggle, asking that the cup pass from him and yet submitting his will to the Father's. This inner tension shows that true obedience is not the absence of fear, but faithfulness despite it. And when the disciples sleep, unable to watch, the loneliness becomes even more evident. The arrest happens abruptly, breaking the silence of the night, and violence quickly erupts, not as justice, but as a defensive response from a threatened system. Jesus does not resist, does not summon legions, does not try to escape, and this choice is disconcerting because it contradicts all instincts of self-preservation, revealing that the path to redemption will not be opened by force, but by surrender. The disciples flee, each dealing with fear in a different way, showing that human courage has limits when confronted with real risk. During the trials, injustice becomes evident as testimonies are distorted, accusations fabricated, decisions rushed, and Jesus' silence in the face of many accusations is not weakness, but a refusal to legitimize a process that has already decided the outcome. When he is condemned, humiliated, and handed over to crucifixion, the promise seems to be crumbling before everyone's eyes because the expected Messiah is now treated as a criminal, and this radical reversal exposes the fragility of human expectations. As I follow Jesus to the cross, I realize that suffering is not only physical, but relational and spiritual, for he experiences abandonment, mockery, and a sense of distance, and the cry he utters is not an act, but a real expression of pain, showing that God does not avoid the most extreme human experience, but goes through it. And this moment concentrates all the tension of the biblical story, because what was promised as restoration now passes through death. And the question that echoes is, inevitable. Does everything end here? Has chaos won? Has the promise failed? When Jesus gives up his spirit and silence takes over, there is no immediate resolution, only shock, confusion, and grief, and a sense of failure sets in. For the promised kingdom seems to have been interrupted in the most violent way possible, and the disciples hide, fearing reprisals, trying to process the loss. And this painful pause keeps the narrative suspended, because the cross, in itself, does not offer easy answers. It only exposes the depth of love and the cost of redemption, and the story now seems to be heading towards an unexpected end, leaving open the central question of whether the promise will truly find a meaningful conclusion in the face of so much pain. I remain within that heavy silence that followed Jesus' death, a silence unlike any other in history, because it is not merely an absence of sound, it is a suspension of meaning, and the disciples live those hours hidden, locked away, afraid of being next, trying to understand how everything could crumble so quickly. And this psychological state is crucial, because it reveals that the cross was not immediately interpreted as a spiritual victory, but as absolute failure. And this makes what is about to happen even more significant, because no one was expecting redemption at that moment. No one was prepared for hope. And when expectation is zero, any sign of life becomes revolutionary. When the women go to the tomb, they carry no expectation of a miracle, but of mourning, spices, and farewell. And this detail reveals a profound truth, for their faith at that moment is not manifested in anticipation, but in practical faithfulness. And upon finding the stone removed and the body absent, confusion sets in before joy, for the human heart takes time to interpret good news when it has been trained by recent pain. The message announced is not celebratory in a human tone, but simple, direct, and almost disconcerting. He is not here. This statement breaks the logic of death as an endpoint, opening a possibility that still seems too absurd to be accepted immediately. When Jesus appears, he doesn't emerge with a public spectacle or a triumphant speech, but in an intimate, gradual way, allowing recognition to happen at the pace of emotional restoration. This detail is essential because the resurrection is not just a theological event, it's psychological healing. It rebuilds wounded trust, restores meaning to trauma, and repositions painful memories within a new narrative. When Jesus shows the marks, he doesn't erase the cross, but incorporates it, revealing that victory doesn't negate pain, but transcends and transforms it. This completely redefines the understanding of power, success, and redemption. While accompanying the disciples on the road to Emmaus, I realize that the presence of Jesus is not immediately recognized. And this reveals something profound about the human heart, because resurrected hope is not always immediately identified, especially when it comes in a different form than expected. And it is only in the breaking of bread, in a familiar gesture, that eyes are opened, showing that revelation often happens in simple, everyday details, and not only in extraordinary manifestations. And this divine pedagogy teaches that God allows himself to be recognized where there is openness, not where there is demand. When Jesus breathes on the disciples and speaks of being sent, the narrative takes a fundamental leap, because the promise that began in Eden, passed through patriarchs, kings, prophets, exile, and the cross, now transforms into a mission. And this changes everything, because the restoration is not restricted to one people or territory, but begins to advance through ordinary people, full of fear, doubts, and recent scars, and yet empowered by something new, the Spirit, which comes not only as a substitute for physical presence, but as an expansion of the divine presence in all places. Observing the ascension, I realized that it does not represent abandonment, but transition, because Jesus does not withdraw to be absent, but to govern in another way. And the disciples remain gazing at the sky until they are called back to reality, showing that the Christian faith is not based on spiritual nostalgia, but on present responsibility. And this responsibility is manifested intensely at Pentecost, when the Spirit descends not to create an isolated spectacle, but to form a community, marked by sharing, courage, and witness. And this community is born not perfect but alive, carrying the same tension that has always marked human history, now traversed by an irreversible hope. As the church begins to spread, facing persecution, misunderstanding, and internal conflicts, I realize that the pattern hasn't completely changed, as there are still flaws, disagreements, and pain. But something essential has been transformed, because now death no longer has the final word. And this certainty changes how suffering is faced, as it ceases to be an end and becomes a passage. And this change in perspective sustains faith even in hostile contexts, allowing the message to cross cultural, political, and social boundaries. Upon reaching the apocalypse, I find not an escape from history, but its symbolic closure. For the final vision does not present an escape from the world, but its complete restoration, with heaven and earth united, tears wiped away, and chaos definitively contained. This final image does not erase the journey, but honors it, showing that each step, each fall, each pain carried throughout the narrative finds meaning in an outcome where God dwells with humankind, not as a visitor, but as a permanent presence. When I look back and observe this entire history, I realize that the Bible is not a collection of disconnected moral lessons, but a continuous narrative of God repeatedly entering human chaos to redeem, organize, and restore. This story doesn't end on old pages, because it continues to unfold in the lives of those who allow themselves to be reached by this living promise. This final realization doesn't close everything with easy answers, but with solid hope. Because the same God who began the story in the midst of darkness ends by affirming that the light will no longer be threatened. This certainty sustains everything that came before, showing that no pain, no fall, and no night was wasted. If something touched you while listening to this story, don't let it pass in silence. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel to continue walking through these stories that not only teach, but heal. Share this video with someone who needs to rediscover meaning, hope, or direction. And if you feel it in your heart, write in the comments which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step in restoration.